So welcome everybody to our first roundtable discussion on the concept of oikophobia. This came up in an email chat list that we were discussing, and it just seemed that everybody had lots of things to say about this. So I was very happy that both Alexander and Steve Balch agreed to speak to us tonight. This in the Classical Forum is a group that formed after the reactions to October 7th in order to provide a space where people could talk openly and freely about subjects of common interest in the world today. It's composed mainly of classical scholars and people in related fields. We're very happy to have our speakers today. It's a special honor to welcome Professor Stephen Balch today. He's a distinguished scholar and leader whose career has been devoted to defending liberal education, academic freedom, and the study of Western civilization. He's taught political science at UC Berkeley, Rutgers, and SUNY, where he spent 14 years at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. In 1987, he founded the National Association of Scholars, serving as its president for more than 2 decades, and continuing today on its board and as editor-in-chief of Academic Questions. He's co-authored influential studies on higher education, including The Dissolution of General Education and Losing the Big Picture, and has played a central role in organizations dedicated to liberal learning, such as the American Council of Trustees and Alumni and the American Academy for Liberal Education. In 2012, he founded the Institute for the Study of Western Civilization at Texas Tech University. Among his many honors is the National Humanities Medal, awarded in 2007 by President George W. Bush. He will be speaking today on the rise of the unrestrained intellectual, power, grievance, and the modern West. Please join me in welcoming Professor Steve Balch.
Well, thank you all very much. I've not involved myself in any of the back and forth commentary on your, I guess it's a chat room, but I do pay attention to it. So I guess that makes me, in internet parlance, a lurker, someone who is up and about reading. The reason I don't involve myself is I'm a slow typist, and if I wanted to say everything that I was moved to say, it would, given the demands on my time, take up too much of it. But I do appreciate all that you do, and I'm delighted to be here. What I'm going to talk about is actually treated in a book that will appear, along with a lot of other things, sometime, I think, in the next 6 months. It's going to be published by Cambridge Scholars Press, a UK publishing house, and it's called Naturalizing History. And it's an effort to reconceive human history in the same terms as people analyze life history and the course of evolution, transporting concepts from one to another, actually both ways. And in doing that, I think I can shed at least some new light on topics that have been already much analyzed in different ways, like the rise of the West or the scientific revolution. So stay tuned for that. I won't go deeply into the theoretical framework of that book, which looks at social relations from an ecological point of view, in which rather than species being the major players and evolving, human roles, are the major players and evolve. They're not quite the same as species, obviously. People play different roles and move back and forth. Member of a species is stuck with being a member of a species. But all that aside, I'm not going to get into what I'm going to say at that level of abstraction. So what I will say is that I think oikophobia, hatred of the home, uh, in the West today, uh, is a pretty new phenomenon. It's hard to think of times in the past where elites have expressed active dislike for the heritage of their societies. It's not really uh, in the interests, for the most part, of elites to do that, since they are elites and they're the head of these societies. The only parallels I can think of are revolutionary elites in relatively recent times. And so the Bolsheviks really, there wasn't much about Russia that they liked. They certainly didn't like its economic system. They didn't like its religion. They didn't like its government, its ruling class. Um, they did after what they didn't do in terms of dislike. What they didn't do was sort of dislike the population of the country. They thought they were acting in its interests. They thought it had virtues. They were working class and peasant virtues, not Russian virtues particularly, but they didn't despise, you might say, the legacy population of Russia. So they didn't quite go so far. Didn't condemn it. Didn't look down on it. Didn't think it was sort of the carrier of a noxious legacy. They didn't quite go as far as many contemporary Western cultural and intellectual elites do, but they certainly didn't like, by and large, the country they were taking over. That began to change once they were in power and once they faced the fact that they had enemies on the outside. Then they began to see more in ancient Russian culture that they liked, the populist part of Russian culture. And so they rehabilitated. Alexander Nevsky became a hero in the 1930s, and even Peter the Great, was seen as a modernizer. His statue was allowed to stand in St. Petersburg, the horseman statue. Same thing true in China. And again, that eventually changed. The high point of self-hate, China, I guess, was the Cultural Revolution. All the olds were bad. But after that, they got a grip on themselves, the Chinese elites, and realized they were, after all, governing China, and it couldn't be all bad. And increasingly, they gravitated towards more and more of a recognizable nationalism. Now in America's schools for a long time, they were sponsoring Confucius Institutes. Confucius, I guess, wasn't such a bad fellow. So you do have those examples. They do have in common with contemporary Western examples the fact that they were carried by intellectuals. But when the intellectuals took power, they had to reconsider them. So we have intellectuals who really seem to not like the societies that they're part of and their cultural inheritance. And to explain that, I think, there are various ways of explaining it, obviously, and I'm not suggesting that I have the only one. But the one I want to emphasize is one that looks at sort of ecological factors, but and I think can bring a kind of a new perspective. I won't say I'm the only person who argues this way, but a new perspective in terms of what is normally heard. So, what is unusual about the modern West is that, first of all, because it's a wealthy society, it has lots of people who have been educated and who think of themselves, even if maybe they don't live up to it in our view, perhaps in terms of the quality of their thought, who think of themselves as intellectuals, are conversant with various theories and views of intellectuals past. We have a lot of people like that. Secondly, we live in liberal societies, and that means that unlike in the past, you can pretty much say what you please and have been able to do that for a long time without being thrown in jail or censored in some other way. So you have that. That's been true for, in some places, for almost 200 years, but in varying lengths of time, it's been true. It's liberal social order. And thirdly, intellectuals in the West, and here I'm speaking mainly of the United States, though I think there are a lot of parallels in Europe, have been able to entrench themselves. Not only have they entrenched themselves in certain institutions, pivotal institutions, in terms of the making of culture, namely educational institutions, starting in the United States, top down, with the universities and then through schools of education in the lower schools as well. And they have insulated these institutions through a variety of practices collectively known as academic freedom, but I think corrupted versions of academic freedom that allow them not only to speak freely, but to have lifelong tenure or something very close. And also to choose who gets hired, who succeeds them, to monopolize the process of intellectual recruitment. So these are pivotal institutions in terms of shaping the larger culture, and also bastions, very difficult for the larger society to control and to punish if they wish to. These intellectuals have also, though I think this is beginning to fade and be replaced by other things, have also put out the notion that what they do is science. So they trade on the great prestige and power of science, which is one of the defining institutions of the modern West. And when people want to interfere with them, they not only have the regime of academic self-governance and academic freedom to fall back on, but they also have the claim that we're like scientists. We may not literally be scientists, but we're doing something that is very expert, that requires very specialized knowledge, that you only can come to after many years of training and socialization. And you guys on the outside are a bunch of yahoos, and you don't know what you're doing when it comes to what we do. So steer clear. It's in the best interest of society that we be left alone. Whatever you may think offhand, we know better. So that's a kind of battery of defenses that modern intellectuals have. And again, that puts them in a pivotal position because they educate the elites in every area, not just in education, but in journalism, the literary world, the entertainment world, business world, you name it, they educate those people. And while conservatives in the United States for a long time thought that all that education would be shed as people left the university and began to engage themselves in the realities of living, had families and jobs. And of course, that sometimes happens to a degree. It doesn't always happen. In fact, to a significant extent, these people's views remain colored by what they've learned and what their peers now also believe after they leave. So, why do intellectuals doing all this gravitate towards the rejection of their own society? And again, my ecological explanation is that's where you can most easily, assuming all the other things I said were true. Back in the old days, of course, if you were an intellectual and you preached subversively, in the old days, intellectuals were sort of subordinate group that by and large supported warrior elites. This is pretty much the case everywhere in the world. China is probably an exception to it. The story there they actually more or less governed the place forever. But in most places, including Western pre-modern history, you had warrior elites who were in charge, and then you had intellectuals who were largely in the church. And these intellectuals had status, had privilege, They did play a role in long-term formation of culture. Occasionally, they exerted independent agency, like the Protestant Reformation, and then a creeping force during the Enlightenment. They did begin to disseminate views that destabilized the established order, but that was generally a short-term phenomenon. The Reformation churches, after they were created, after the princes who backed them broke from the papacy, the Reformation churches then fell again, more or less under government control, under the control of the traditional elites. There are other exceptions here. Obviously, there have been some societies that were sort of theocratically run, the papacy itself, Tibetan Lamism, and again, Confucian China is probably the biggest place where intellectuals might be said to have actually been in a commanding role. Warrior elites were secondary over there, perhaps because China, given its geographical position, didn't have to worry too much, as much as at least European states and other states did, about being sort of a militarized presence, fending off foreign invasion. They had to worry about barbarians in the north, but they didn't have to worry about other peer states. So this traditional subordination gets cast off as the liberal institutions begin to develop in the West. And once they develop, intellectuals realize that they gradually realize, it's a bumpy ride, but they gradually realize that they can say what they please and they secure themselves in their favorite and pivotal institutions. And the reason that they take on an adversarial role, there are many reasons, but the major reason is that it's a way in which you can attract an audience. Every society has latent grievances. Every society is made up of people who live in, to use a Christian term here, a fallen world. I describe the roots of it somewhat differently, but it is a fallen world, and everyone is dissatisfied and wish life would be better. Science puts forward for the first time the possibility of a secular utopia. Through science, we can master nature in Bacon's manner, and then put the world to rights, not only master nature, but figure out an ideal way for governing ourselves. So you have these possibilities, ideological possibilities that can be put forward, and you gain a following by doing this. People listen to you. People want to hear things like this. And if they don't get punished for hearing them, and if you don't get punished for hearing them, all sorts of careers can be made, preaching careers. So the universities turn into sanctums of preaching rather than of inquiry and old-fashioned liberal education. Sanctums of preaching. Journalism becomes a great muckraking enterprise when journalists sort of pick up on this new outlook. There are lots of political careers to be made because the world is terribly unsatisfying. And there's a rational model of reconstruction out there that you can adhere to. Well, there's then a lot for a politician and a political activist to do. Government can grow. It has a new legitimizing mission. It's no longer just about order and about preserving a state that will get you to heaven, a church rather, that will get you to heaven. It's about building this brave new world. And that requires a lot of work, and there are a lot of jobs there. I'm making this sound rather banal, but I think in the long term, it is. I'm not suggesting that people who follow this course have my view, and thus are great cynics. They believe. People believe what it's advantageous to them to believe, usually. Science is somewhat unusual in managing to extract real honest truths. But we won't go into why I think that's different from most discourse. I'm not against, humanistic discourse seeking truth. I think it can do. But the pull is always in a different direction. The pull is in doing things that get you somewhere. And so we have, not through any conspiracy, but through a sort of great spontaneous reorganization of the intellectual world. A reorganization around these kind of insurgent views. Now, there are conceivably insurgent views that are not leftist. There are tribal insurgent views. Fascism, Nazism were insurgent views too in their day. Um, uh, and they might conceivably become more popular with intellectuals, but for historical reasons, for path dependency, largely the result of the Second World War and its outcome. Those kinds of views lost their um, they lost their hold. They were kind of delegitimized among intellectuals. There were many more rightist intellectuals before the Second World War than there are now. So that's something that is a aspect of history that didn't have to be as it turned out, but it did turn out. So the people who espouse this are not self-haters. The intellectuals who espouse this think very highly of themselves. They think that they are a noble group of redeemers who have risen above the ordinary consciousness and now see the world in a clear new way. And like Moses, they are going to lead everyone else out of the wilderness and into a promised land, a secular utopia. They've more or less abandoned the kind of theoretical structures of Marxism, though they retain its sensibility and the feeling, the passion behind it. But they don't think badly of themselves. So when one talks about them and their role in the Western world, one's not talking about self-hate. Also, they are inviting those, including people who are not members of the various minorities that they have more recently been trying to rally, but who are just sort of straight white people, Westerners in the old-fashioned sense. They are inviting these people to also become part of the Redeemers. They're not telling them that they should think bad of themselves forever. They should only think bad of themselves insofar as they unreflectively perpetuate the beliefs and the mores of the past. But if they cast them off, if they're born again, secular religiosity, if they're born again, then even the whitest and straightest of males can still hold his head high. And that's what they're hoping and inviting him to do. So, what would happen if they finally come to power? They have a lot of power right now. In the United States, they kind of episodically exercise it. They had a lot of the whole DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, was a kind of code word for their ideology. Sort of reigned during the Biden administration. It'll come back, I think, with even greater force should they oust the Trumpists in a future election. At some point, of course, they have to wake up to the fact that the society is theirs. If that's what eventually happens, they'll have to wake up to the fact that the society is theirs, and they better stop trying to dismantle it. They better start trying to preserve it in some fashion if they want to continue to rule. They'll be in the place where the Stalin was in the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War was patriotic, and where Mao's successors are today. So presumably, if their revolution is going to hold, is going to prove viable in the longer term, they're going to have to adjust and find things now. The kind of societies, Russia at least was a pretty unified national state in terms of, well, more or less. It did have a Russian majority, and China is very homogeneous ethnically. So they had that to build on. What's happening in the West, of course, where the societies are becoming polyglot and heterogeneous in a whole variety of ways, it's harder to know how you build unity there. But I assume that if this new revolutionary elite takes hold and can last, it has to find some basis for being proud again of the social order over which it presides. Even if it's a somewhat remade social order, it has to find elements of positivity in it. So, well, that's my view. I have spoken.
Okay. Okay, thank you. That's for this fascinating a view of things. And we will be taking questions on both of the talks after the second talk. So let me move on to Dr. Alexander Rosenthal-Pubul. He's a pillar of the Classical Forum community already for many years. He received his bachelor's degree in philosophy from Princeton University and his PhD um, from the Katholieke. How do we pronounce this in Dutch? Universiteit.
Katholieke Universiteit Leuven. But don't worry
Okay.
about it. Leuven.
He currently teaches political theory at Johns Hopkins University, where he also served as assistant director of the Center for Governmental Studies. He's taught at several universities, and his research spans political philosophy and European intellectual history. His publications include Crown Under Law, on the intellectual origins of modern constitutionalism, the theoretic life, a classical ideal, and its modern fate, on Aristotelian contemplation and the classical liberal arts, and most recently co-authored with Graham McAleer, The Wisdom of Our Ancestors, Conservative Humanism, and the Western Tradition in 2023, Defending the Classical and Christian Foundations of Western Humanism. Today he will speak on oikophobia and the revolt against transcendent order, a diagnosis of a Western disorder. Please welcome Dr. Alexander Rosenthal-Pubul.
Thank you very much. I'm trying to share the screen, so hopefully it's there. So thank you very much to the Classical Forum and to Gabriel and to everyone for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to be speaking with you. I'm going to try to present a kind of, we could say, philosophical, theological theory about oikophobia that is maybe in some ways complementary to Steve's institutional understanding of its origins. I don't think they really contradict, but I want to get at the ideological foundations. So I have more slides than are necessary, but I've color coded the ones I'm going to stop at. But if you see a slide that interests you that I'm not going, that I'm just running through in the discussion, please feel free to let me know. So 2020 was a high was a year of oikophobia. If you were living in the United States or even in Britain, many of the among other things during the rioting that was going on that year were attacks on figures that were traditional heroes of the West that were once lauded, including, as you could see in this photo, Christopher Columbus, George Washington, one of the central founders of the United States, and Sir Winston Churchill. And I think we could understand this as a, Roger Scruton spoke of a culture of repudiation, sort of rituals of repudiation of the Western past. So it's a good reminder that what starts in the university doesn't always stay in the university, that there are social consequences when the educational systems become ideological. Okay, so table of contents. So I have basically four things that I want to do. One is define what oikophobia is, and I'll try to explain my thesis. Briefly, I want to talk about, because I'm going to draw on the thought of Eric Voegelin. He talks a lot about the transcendent order, so I'm going to describe what I think that is. Then the Christian order, and then modern ideology and the revolt against transcendence and how we get to oikophobia. So I know this probably is not clear at this moment, but hopefully in the course of the talk, it will become clearer. Okay, so the term oikophobia comes from Sir Roger Scruton. He wrote an article called Oikophobia, corresponding to xenophobia or hatred and suspicion of the foreigner. Oikos from home, right? A suspicion of the home, a hatred of one's own home, which he argues has been a symptom in the West since the Enlightenment, intellectuals turning against their own cultural and civilizational inheritance. What are some of the ways oikophobia has manifested recently? We could choose countless examples. Steve has the National Association of Scholars, which Steve was founding president of, has done wonderful studies on the fate of the West in education. But we could look at Stanford as a case study. So in 1988, they decided to remove Western civilization requirements, and students were chanting, "Hey, hey, ho, ho, Western culture's got to go," which became sort of a popular catchphrase. There was an effort in 2016 to revive it, and I think that this statement to revive the Western civilization requirement, I think this statement from Erica Krieger, White Civ's Burden, pretty much encapsulate what I think contemporary oikophobia is like, right? So she wrote, a Western civ requirement would necessitate that our education be centered on upholding white supremacy, capitalism, and colonialism, and all other oppressive systems that flow from Western civilizations. That our education be framed as a tool to carrying out our burden to reform the rest of the world in our own imperfect, acutely deplorable image. So an important point that I think I want to make is that oikophobia and self-critique are two very different things, right? I mean, both the biblical and the Greek Greco-Roman traditions have important elements of self-critique, which I would characterize as a strength of the West and not a weakness. The West, like every other civilization, has had its own injustices and sometimes brutal atrocities. So critiquing and trying to correct those is not in any way oikophobia. But where oikophobia, I think, shows up is in asymmetrical judgments, right? So when Western wrongs are treated as structural and essential, and non-Western wrongs are minimized or blamed on the West itself, we may be dealing with something like oikophobia. Now, the first question, what I want to try to argue in this talk is that oikophobia is an ideological and not a fact-based phenomenon, right? In other words, it comes out of an ideological concept. It's not that the West is compared historically with other civilizations and with an objective analysis found wanting. Because the question would be, against what moral standard is the Western civilization being judged? Is it being judged against the other historic civilizations, or is it being judged, as I will argue, against a hypothetical future society that's never actually existed, that realizes moral standards of equality and justice that have never actually been actualized in the world? One of the most common critiques of Western civilization is that it is imperialistic, right? But is that a unique feature of Western culture? We could look at the campaigns of the Qianlong Emperor in China that included a genocide, the Dzungar genocide. The Fatih Mosque, which is built in Turkey over the Church of the Holy Apostles, is named after Mehmed the Conqueror. So we see other civilizations naming their holy places after their great imperial conquerors. They're the wars of the Mongol Empire that caused millions of lives. The Aztec Empire with its human sacrifices in the New World and so forth. So we could go on and on and on, showing that imperialism is not a specifically Western trait, but a human trait. And the brutalities of imperialism are also not unique to the West. What is, I think, quite unusual about the West is how self-critique operated within those imperial systems. So we can look at, for example, the two Spanish Dominicans, Bartolome de las Casas and Francisco de Vitoria, who were pioneers of modern concepts of human rights in defending the rights of the Native Americans. Or we could look at Sir William Wilberforce, who led the British Empire in abolishing slavery between 1807 and 1833. The slave trade, and then slavery itself was abolished. And European empires throughout the 19th century made the abolition of slavery one of their objectives. So these things also have to be figured into any objective historical evaluation. The structure of oikophobic ideologies. So this is what I would see as some of the core elements. So power and privilege are treated as inherently suspect, while weakness and victimhood are treated as moral currency. The oppressor-oppressed binary. History and politics tend to be reduced to a simple binary between Western oppressors and non-Western victims with little moral agency. The culture of repudiation. So there's the idea that the West stands under a burden of sin from the past. And so one has to ritually repudiate one's past, whether this is through iconoclasm, destroying statues, toppling statues, decolonizing, quote unquote, curricula to remove the Western canon, or to reconceptualize the Western canon as sort of malign and in a cynical way. And what we also find is that almost always there's a progressive view of history, where those who resist the changes are viewed as on the wrong side of history, right? I mean, so there's an assumption that history itself is redemptive and moving toward a rectification of social injustices. Okay, so I'm going to be looking at Eric Voegelin's idea about modern ideology as a repudiation of the Western of a transcendent order, and sort of the bringing of the kingdom of God, we could say, to earth. That this is really the characteristic of Western ideologies. But I want to just very briefly just say a couple of things about the foundations of the Western order that Voegelin thinks is under attack, and help to explain Western ideologies. And then I want to show how current oikophobic ideologies fit into the general pattern of the revolt against the transcendent, the immanentization of the eschaton, that is the kingdom of God, and so forth. So I just want to go through this very briefly. So basically, Voegelin understands Plato is almost a perfect exemplification of what he understands by order, what Voegelin understands by order. So order is not first and foremost political. It's first and foremost about attunement to the transcendent, right? Attunement to a real order of being. And this is basically the Platonic discovery of the transcendent, the to agathon, this idea of a divine reality which is above and beyond anything cosmic, right? And the soul, when it's attuned to this reality, is in order. And then we have the polis. The soul is like a small polis, a small city state, and the city is like the large city state. The disorders that appear in politics are functions of disorder in the soul. So rather than privileging institutions, he views problems in the political life as emanating, we could say, from problems in the soul. And every culture has some kind of relationship, we could say, to the transcendent in different ways. Why is Plato important for Voegelin, right? So first of all, transcendence is a principle of restraint. If there's something above the state, that means that the state can be judged by something higher than itself. So this is why I think he was famously very against Karl Popper's idea that Plato was an enemy, was basically a proto-totalitarian. He thought that Popper didn't really understand Plato, that in fact this idea of the transcendence of the good provides a way by which societies can be judged. And so he didn't see the Republic, he thought it was a misreading to see it as like a political blueprint, so much as a symbol, as spoken of in Book 2 of the Republic, of the right order of the soul, right? Attunement to transcendence. Like I said, disorder in the polis stems from disorder in the soul, not in institutions. And man stands in what Voegelin calls the metaxy, between eternity and time, transcendent and immanent, sensible and intelligible, irreducibly. This is an aspect of human existence that cannot be changed. So, just say a couple of things about the biblical, right? So one of the things that he will accent is how the biblical worldview broke from previous worldviews, right? So in the pre-Israel Near Eastern cultures, or at least non-Israel Near Eastern cultures, they were what Voegelin calls compacted, meaning the transcendent is not really distinguished from the cosmic. Nature and its cycles really provides the model for religion. We have this idea of a creation, like in the Babylonian myths, and then there is a ritual order which maintains the cycle, the never-ending cycle of birth and rebirth, along with the seasons and fertility and so forth, and an idea of sacred kingship, that basically the gods are sort of direct appointees, right, mirroring the rule of the gods in the heavens. So he gives great importance to Israel for its encounter with transcendence, both because it's an opening to transcendence, as Plato was, right? Opening to a reality of a God who has no form, who's beyond creation, who's not a cosmic God, but also because history becomes a central locus of meaning, right? So rather than that cycle, what you have with Israel is sort of a set of non-repeatable events where God reveals himself, right? Adam, Noah, Abraham, the encounter of Israel at Sinai, the prophets, the Davidic monarchy, and then looking forward to the Messianic age. So it's a completely new way of conceiving of history. Now we'll turn to the Christian order. So there's a couple of things about the Christian order. I thought Tom Holland might be helpful, and we'll see how these ideas get retooled in the modern ideologies. So he thinks on an ethical level, Tom Holland thinks Christianity did two fundamental things. One is universalism, right? So the great distinctions in the ancient world more or less get abolished as being of fundamental importance in Christianity, like in Paul's famous statement that there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. That would have been viewed in the first century by most people as something astonishing, even revolutionary to say that these were the most important divisions that existed among human beings. And the second is this idea of solidarity with the victim, overturning, let's say, the tendency to privilege the strong and the powerful and to glorify strength. So Holland says, right, that the Son of God, born of a woman and sentenced to the death of a slave, had perished unrecognized by his judges, was a reflection fit to give pause to even the haughtiest monarch. God was closer to the weak than to the mighty, to the poor than to the rich. So the last will be first and the first last. So the idea is unjust power, unjust suffering do not have the final word in God's plan. And God is solidarious, we could say, with the weak and the suffering. And we'll see that these ideas, the idea, let's say, that that the victim or the oppressed or the is something you find very often in the modern ideologies as well in new forms. Now, the big question that was faced by early Christianity was, what did this mean? The last shall be first. Was it speaking of something that might occur in history? And in the book of Revelation, it speaks of Christ returning to reign on earth for 1,000 years. Was that symbolic, or did it mean something else? On the other hand, there are other passages that suggest there is no worldly utopia of perfect equality and justice and where evil and suffering will be overcome. My kingdom is not of the world, of this world, as Jesus says in the Gospels. Now, there's been a recurrent tendency within Christianity toward what's called millenarianism, to view, which is, rejected normatively, but keeps resurfacing, rejected by the church normatively, but has resurfaced in different ways and in different forms. How does this temptation of Christian millenarianism work? What are its key ideas? The first is the present age is viewed as fallen and oppressive. Its institutions are viewed as under satanic power. Often there's a sharp division between a righteous remnant. There's often critique of social hierarchies and institutions, and even the official church are all seen as part of the oppressive order. And history is moving towards this apocalyptic conflict of good and evil, and Christ will come within history to vanquish evil and establish a 1,000-year kingdom on the earth itself. Now, Voegelin gives great importance to the fact that Augustine basically draw together Platonism and biblical ideas, but strongly rejected millenarianism, right? So Augustine's idea is that there are two cities, right? The city of man, the terrestrial city, and the city of God, right? And what does he say about the city of man? Well, he says Augustine says that Cain is the father of the earthly city, right? Cain is a fratricide. So the earthly city is characterized by conflict and bloodshed, right? As he puts it, the earthly city is ruled by the lust to rule, right? Which means that the fate of the earthly city are constant quarrels, conflicts, wars, competing centers of power, and so forth. And this is more or less how he thinks the city of the terrestrial city is going to be. History is tragic, not redemptive. There's no earthly salvation, political salvation from these things. They can be ameliorated, particular evils can be fought there, and so forth, but no final vanquishing, we could say, of these evils. So Christian hope is concentrated on the transcendent realm for Augustine. The longing for perfect peace and justice are fulfilled in the eternal city, not in the earthly city. So this is more or less the Augustinian picture: a transcendent world and an immanent world, which are distinct, right? And so there's no earthly, earthly political type of salvation. So what does this mean? So the doctrines of original sin and the heavenly city provide a foundation for Christian realism. The nature of man is fallen and imperfect. There's no simple division between the good and the evil in history. Everyone is implicated in sin. There's no side of the good, of the perfect good, and side of the perfect evil. And the city of God acts as a restraining principle by placing hope beyond history. But what happens, and Voegelin goes into this in some detail, we won't go through his whole historical excursus. Millenarianism resurfaces in the transition from the medieval to the modern world. And one of the first revolutions in which this was successful revolutions, we could say, there were others. The king is executed, millenarian fervent millenarian sects like the Fifth Monarchists, and there's a wave of iconoclasm, all right? So crosses and images of Mary and the saints are destroyed, and these sorts of things, everything that connected with the old order. Now, what Voegelin thinks is that this millenarian temptation gets secularized in modernity. That, by the way, is an image of the Church of Our Savior being destroyed by the Bolsheviks after the Russian Revolution. Well, we know that in the Enlightenment, the idea of progress becomes very powerful, right? So Condorcet's idea of history is moving toward the true perfection of mankind. History is a march of progress, going from the primitive and backward to the more advanced. And there's and so this is Voegelin on how millenarianism got secularized. I think the turning point would be the French Revolution. So British millenarians actually welcomed the French Revolution. They viewed it as the judgment of God against the monarchy and the Catholic Church and so forth. But the French revolutionaries themselves took a secular tack, and basically everything connected with the old regime, including, there were massacres of priests and nuns, and the churches were shut down and turned into the temple of reason and these sorts of things. And also time was ritually, the old calendar was abolished. Even the 7-day week, which was seen as too biblical because of the Jewish Sabbath, they changed it to decades, and they restarted the calendar not from the birth of Jesus Christ, but from year one of the revolution. So this kind of year zero thinking. Probably the best example and the most potent example in history of secularized millenarianism would be Karl Marx, right? So Marx, in his contribution to a critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, argued that the problem with religion was that it gave people hope in a world beyond this one, right? And so left people sort of with this hope, and therefore they were not willing to be revolutionaries in this world and to overthrow the conditions of injustice under which they suffer. So Marx said the abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people is the demand for their real happiness. And we see this imminent, there's no transcendence, of course, at all. The eschaton, the kingdom of God, we could say, is reconceptualized as the classless society, right? So there's this original Edenic communism, the primitive communism that Engels, among others, talks about. And then there's class society. And then at the end of history, there's this classless society where there's no more greed or exploitation or injustice. And of course, Leon Trotsky, two things the Bolsheviks did was try to destroy all that pertained to the old order, and spoke about creating a new man, right? The new Soviet man. So we're going to destroy all that was old. Now, it's true that Stalin during World War II reclaimed some aspects, as Steve had talked about, of the Russian tradition. But this was the early trajectory, we could say, Bolshevism. Eliminate all that was old and rebuild man from the start. Now, of course, this led to a great deal of cruelty, as we know. Marxism explicitly reduced history to oppressor and oppressed. History moves toward the eschaton, the classless society of social equality, where oppression will cease to exist, and opponents are on the wrong side of history. So tens of millions of people, this is from the killing fields of Cambodia, tens of millions of people were murdered under communist regimes in the course of the 20th century. Just going back for a second to this, I think, so basically what I think we should look at is, if you judge society from this hypothetical endpoint, everything that comes before is oppression, right? So it's not that you don't hate the future society you're building, but you're going to hate, in some sense, everything that comes before it if you adopt this kind of view about this kind of ideological view of history. Now, the question I would ask is millenarianism over? John Gray, a British political philosopher, remarking on the outbreaks of 2020, referred explicitly to millenarianism, right? The destruction of the statues and this sort of thing is very reminiscent of a recurrent pattern that we've seen in the modern history of the West. The current convulsion is an outbreak more closely akin to the anarchical millenarian movements that raged across Europe in the late Middle Ages, whose vision of redemption from history was shared by Americans' founders who carried it with them to the New World. And he talked about cleansing themselves and others of sin is their goal. So the idea is that these categories haven't been abolished, right? These categories that are ultimately religious categories, they've been sort of retooled in the service of an imminent political goal, a political future, salvation through politics, right? Through some political movement. Tom Holland also talks about how religion, I mean, because one of the things you see about these movement is that victimhood has moral currency. If you can show you that you're the side of the victim, you're viewed as worthy of greater sympathy than if you're viewed as in the oppressor class, right? Uh, and so he Holland sees the Christian resonance of that as well. He did not think in the age of Julius Caesar it would be very likely people would see victimhood as moral currency, right? When Vercingetorix was carried through the streets of Rome or whatnot, the reaction was glorying in the triumph, not a sorrow for the victim. So he said that any condemnation of Christianity as patriarchal and repressive derived from a framework of values that itself was utterly Christian. 2,000 years on, and the discovery made by Christ's early followers that to be a victim might be a source of power could bring out millions onto the streets, right? But of course, it's politicized and ideologicized. We could say if that's a word. So, what do we see about contemporary left-wing identity politics? So, it maintains the Marxist idea of a clash between oppressor and oppressed as the motor of history. But instead of the class categories of Marxism, it focuses on racial, ethnic, and sexual identity, right? So, Europeans, people of European origin are in the oppressor or privileged class. People of non-European origin are in the oppressed class. Straight people might be in the privileged class, and so forth. It's conjoined with an anti-colonial ideology where the West is depicted as structurally racist and imperialist, the oppressor, and non-Westerners are presented as oppressed victims, often with little moral agency. I mean, I've had discussions where someone will discuss the Rwandan genocide and it'll be talked about how, well, really it was ultimately the fault of the Belgians or something like that, as if a genocide doesn't have, as if the, moral agency is taken away to some degree when non-Westerners are involved in crimes and atrocities. And it has elite support in the West itself, within universities, corporations, and governments. The corporate thing that like DEI policies and that sort of thing indicates that in some sense there are aspects within capitalism that are perhaps more congenial to this kind of ideology than to a straight Marxist, orthodox Marxist ideology, which would focus on the working class and its struggle against the capitalist oppressor. Now, why is this all wrong, according to Vogelin? Why are all these ideologies wrong? So he says, well, he says that the problem of an eidos in history arises only when the Christian transcendental fulfillment becomes immanentized, right? So this idea of looking at history like a single intelligible thing only becomes possible once we make the Christian eschaton into something immanent, into something that's within history. Such an immanentist hypothesis of the eschaton, however, is a theoretical fallacy. The course of history as a whole is no object of experience. History has no eidos because the course of history extends into the unknown future. In other words, history is open. There's no way that a human being can understand what it means to be on the right side or the wrong side of history if history is truly open, if there's no known endpoint. But all these ideologies treat history as though there is a known endpoint, and there are those who obstruct it and those who are with the force of history itself. There was a joke, I think, in the Soviet Union that in the Soviet Union, the future is known, it's the past that keeps changing. So I think that's a good illustration of how modern ideologies work. So let me stop there because I probably threw a lot at you. So let me stop over there.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Stephen and Alexander. And now I'm going to open it up for questions. Gabriel?
I'm always willing to start things out, but I think Mario just raised his hand also.
Yeah, Thank you very much, both of you, for very stimulating conversation and thoughts. I was picking up four small elements that, in my opinion, allow us to better contextualize this rise of oikophobia now and here. And one is there is no organic intellectual anymore in the Gramscian sense of things. We are used in history to intellectuals being part of the ruling elite. Now it seems that we have a divorce where, in a liberal capitalistic world where culture is no longer currency and seems to be less relevant, culture goes one way, academia goes one way, and what counts in the technocratic vision, the economic engine of things, goes the other way. So you are either one way, the right is in that camp, and the left stays in that other. The other thing is that there is no church anymore, but it looks like the mechanic of these of the woke agenda and these new academic cult in a way is still the same. There are non-falsifiable hypotheses that are at the basis of a cult with their own priests and a capacity, an enlarged capacity of doing making proselytism. And also, it is intensely anti-national, and it goes instead to promote sovereign-national, multinational order. There is an over-reliance on what the UN says, what UNESCO says, what this body says, versus whatever comes from the nation. And also, the last point that I want to make is there is what Frank Furedi calls the war against the past. So in a way, there was an idea of domesticating history so far. Instead, now this is replaced with the idea that history has no value anymore. It's no currency anymore. It cannot serve as an exemplum anymore. And whatever happened gets routinely replaced with what should have happened, could have happened, ought to have happened instead.
Mario, so can you say your question, or is this just a comment that you want to share with me?
It's a comment, and I would be grateful of feedback on those comments, if you agree or not.
Okay, Stephen or Alexander?
Well, I mean, I guess I could jump in on a couple of those things. So first of all, on the idea of ideology replacing religion, I think that that's sort of clear, and I tried a little bit in my presentation to show how that's the case, right? So a secularized world may reject the idea of a transcendent God or a religious structure, but the human quest for meaning doesn't end because a person rejects God, nor does 2,000 years of heritage disappear of how one's moral intuitions have been formed. So if you know, so on the one hand, these ideologies, at least temporarily, being a devout communist or progressivist or whatever ideology you choose, provides a temporary sense, at least, until the ideology fails, of meaning, right? So there's a quest for meaning in the Western world that's related to its secularization, and also the moral imagination that Christianity brought is still present in these ideologies. So why the underdog preference? Why side with the weak? Why side with the proletariat against the bourgeoisie, right? That sort of thing. Then I think the other thing you also mentioned, attitudes to history. Now, I think that that's kind of an irony. On the one hand, history is viewed as redemptive in the sense that the future course of history is supposed to wipe out injustice and human failings, right? In all these ideologies. And on the other hand, there's very little interest in actual history. So So you have in the academy a shift from, if you were in the early 20th century, the classics would be central to passing on the Western civilizational heritage would be at the center of what you do as an academic. Now they're largely ideologues, not completely, of course, but ideology and activism has largely become very prominent in today's humanities. And then you mentioned also about the capitalists. So I actually might differ a little bit because I think that there's an odd so growing up during the Cold War, I never would have expected to see capitalists and left-wing progressive making common cause. But I think we've seen quite a bit of that, in fact. And some of it might relate to something else you talked about, which was cosmopolitanism, right? So the left is historically somewhat anti-nationalist, right? Marxism had the whole idea of the international and the international workers, and capitalism also, globalization, we could say, right, also has somewhat of an anti-national focus, right? So there's a wide variety of reasons why corporations have shown themselves more amenable to this revised ideology, which is not orthodox Marxism. Right? I mean, the working class is not the focus of it. But I think that there are certain convergences, we could say, between modern, if you want to call it capitalistic, globalistic, whatever you want to call it, commercial society and aspects of left-wing progressivist ideology. So
Thank you, Alexander. I'm going to invite Shmuel for the next question. Oh, yes, for sure, Stephen. I just wanted to move along the discussion, but please do if you want to share.
Just very briefly, I concur with, well, it's a very interesting comment. I concur with part of what Alex said. I think you can see that there's some accommodation with capitalism as the emphasis has been more on identity. The whole idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion sort of posits a group equality rather than individual equality, emphasizes group equality more. So in that scheme of things, you can still have people who do far better than other people, provided that the groups are equally represented in each stratum or each strata. And I think that's something of an accommodation with capitalism. And that's true too with globalism, which fits well with international corporate life. So I'll just add that.
Okay, great. Thank you, Shmuel.
Thank you. Let me just start by saying, that I'm not a classical philosophy student. I belong more to what's called the realist school of international relations. But I want to add some information, first of all, to Professor Balch's interesting history. It will also interest Professor Rosenthal. I was a student at Johns Hopkins in the early 70s. In those days, I remember there was already a Marxist threat. And I remember that I even have the book of Professor Tucker called The Radical Left and American Foreign Policy. The debate was there already. Why am I saying this? I'm an outsider. I went back to Israel. And in those days, it was common that every university, every political science department, I don't know about others, I don't know about in philosophy, had a Marxist there, the token scholar. And I remember I even asked Tucker, why are you so worried about them? There's only one. He said, listen, they are dangerous. And that's why he started writing against them. And what happened maybe you can tell us, from that time that was during the years of Vietnam, and now that this whole thing is more a dominance, in certain universities of the radical scholars. And this brings me to Professor Rosenthal's question, presentation about Vogelin. I never read Vogelin, but I heard. I mean, I read things about him, but I'm not really a study of it. I think there is a certain, if I understand it correct, or understand that there is a certain stress, a certain tension, yes, between religion and Marxism, in the sense that both of them are, I mean, Marxists are also religious people, used to be. However, the Marxists had a problem because they said it's a science and ultimately this will happen. And when it didn't happen, after 70 years, Soviet Union collapsed, and with it, a lot of the Marxist ideology. But on the other hand, the religion had an advantage because it's more transcendent. It's something going to happen in the future. We don't have to be, if it doesn't happen today, it will happen tomorrow. And we are not bound by that's why religion had a comeback. But I don't understand is how, and this is, I relate to my previous presentation, where does this new school belong? The new I mean, are they more like, say, because we are, and this was hinted during the presentations, that there is a certain science here. I mean, if there's a certain science, this whole thing will collapse. Unlike religion, which has this transcendent messianic ultimate future. So, am I correct in saying this may be the weak side? If I take Vogelin and others, if I understand them correctly, say that this is ultimately going to collapse, or am I wrong? And this is the future.
So the fatal day for revolution is when it gains power, and then it becomes evident gradually that it cannot bring about the paradise that was promised. All the old human motivations, power and wealth assert themselves, and the system becomes corrupted. The regime can hold together for a long time. So the Soviet regime lasted 70 years. And if it's in a competitive world, it may not even last that long. But the revolution certainly does not give the fruits that it promised, and people begin to see that, and they adjust. They go from being ideologues to careerists. So yeah, revolutions can't deliver. Religions don't have to deliver because they either put their redemption in some distant future, which God rather than man will determine, or they put it after death.
Thank you, Alexander. Do you want to respond, or we do need to move on?
Yeah, no, I'm just going along also with what Steve was saying, which I think dovetails with what Vogelin would say had he lived to see this. I think if you read Vogelin carefully, he predicted, because he talked a lot about what was happening in American education, even his time. He fled Nazi Germany, where he saw how ideology corrupted. Well, he fled actually Austria, but after the Anschluss. So he saw already what was happening with ideology there, and he saw what was happening in America. So I think he'd be not surprised actually by a lot of the directions. So I think the key point is this idea of immanentizing the eschaton, which is maybe a signature idea, which is that if you compare Marx and Christianity, for example, the things that one might associate with the Christian heaven, right, with the Christian heavenly reality, like perfect justice, universal community, justice, right, delivered by God, right, perfectly, where the wicked get their deserts and the good prosper and so forth, that all these things are associated with something that's going to happen historically, right, for Marx, right? And so Marx's problem with religion was that it made people because it presented the eschaton transcendently, it led people to live happy, hopeful lives with the imperfections of this world, right? So that's the problem for Marx. So you have to destroy religion in order to make the eschaton, as it were, come down to earth. But I think Vogelin would agree with everything Steve said, that since it's false, right, since that's not the way history works, there is no final justice within history. There is no final end of history. They all inevitably fail, and religion's actual strength is outlasting ideology, right? I mean, you saw nobody living in 1925 Russia would imagine 30,000 churches being built in contemporary Russia, right? I mean, the capacity of religion to lay deep roots in a culture and survive even epochs of even erasure and mass persecution is stronger than those of these ideological frameworks that
Thank you,
always fail.
Alexander.
Yeah,
Thank you,
sorry.
Alexander. We need to move on to Michelle.
Thank you for both of your talks. There's an issue that has been working in the background for me, which is kind of, and even this, as I read everybody's lovely emails and learn so much, has been in the background for me a lot. I think that we're all pretty serious about ideas, and we're all pretty serious about reason, and even being able to have reasonable dialogue with one another. And so somebody comes up who we radically disagree with, or think we might disagree with. And the first thing we do is we sit down and we try to understand, we try to put together their best argument as rationally as we can with all the best evidence we can. And then we start reasoning about why it's wrong. It seems to me, and this applies to the oikophobia debate, I think in particular, but to many of the topics we've picked up, the people we are trying to understand, in this case, explicitly reject reason. And I don't have scholars to cite, but for example, I see this in discussions about the common law and the value of the common law a lot, that there's no real reason there. It's not that the reason is at times flawed or makes mistakes, it's that it's pure rationalization. We see the same thing with the tossing of philosophy, right? It's not that Plato was wrong about this or that connection, it's that the entire enterprise that he's engaged in is corrupt. And then corrupt isn't even the right word. It's bad fruit from the beginning. It's not fruit that went astray. And I think also you see this in some of the feminist arguments about reason being an inherently masculine thing. And so long as we're going to reason and we're going to let reason win at the end of the day and decide the debate, that's inherently patriarchal. And as feminists, whoever ascribes to that or doesn't want to be patriarchal needs to toss reason. That doesn't mean we shouldn't go on reasoning. I would never challenge that. But I do sometimes wonder if we are spending so much intellectual capital and effort and trying to debate with people who at the end of the day don't take their own positions seriously and are simply putting them out there as catchphrases for other gullible people and or to keep us busy. So I don't even know if that's a question, but I do think it's important to think about in the context of trying to debate with people who don't believe in the same kind of debate we do. Thanks for your presentations.
Thank you.
So we're running short on time. Do you want to briefly respond to that, or should we move on to the next comment?
The only thing I would say is that this is one of the things that Vogelin says as the mark of ideological thinking, the unwillingness to debate or to allow first principles to be scrutinized, right? So once you realize that somebody was not open to a question about your first principles, you realize you're dealing with an ideologue, right? So that's what Vogelin would say.
It also raises the question of whether Mill's notion of a society in which the good ideas eventually went out over the bad through free discussion is really the way, at least under certain circumstances, things are going to work.
Right. Thank you. Gabriel.
Thank you. Thank you to both of you. This was really very interesting to me. I just want to, something that occurred to me while Alexander was talking, is that, maybe the problem is really with Christianity. I mean, you seem to point out that a lot of the idea, and when I say Christianity, I also mean the late prophets in Judaism, but you pointed out very nicely that the woke ideology is so similar to Christianity. And Christianity was founded in a kind of an antinomian move. I sometimes joke that, I love Christians, I love Catholics. Catholics are wonderful people. They obey the laws of the state that they live in, they obey the laws of the church that they're members of. The only laws they don't obey are those of God and the Bible because we don't have to do that anymore. And it's a very problematic attitude to have. And I would say that in fact, not just the laws that are written are being challenged by Christianity, but the laws of the world, the nature of the world is being challenged. And that has created some fantastic results in some ways in terms of revolutionary approaches to all kinds of things. But at the same time, it's probably creating a lot of the damages that we're seeing today in terms of the dissolution of um, of society as we've known it for a long time. I don't know if there's an answer to that. It's just a comment that I heard. But if one of you have a response, I'd love to hear it.
So the guy to blame here ultimately is Zoroaster, because I think you can make a very good argument that millennialism comes into Judaism during the Babylonian captivity under the influence of Persian dualism, which has all the features of what eventually becomes the Christian millenarianism. A war of good against evil, an ultimate showdown, a Messiah, all that stuff. Actually born of a virgin. It's all Zoroastrian. There aren't many Zoroastrians around anymore, so we tend to forget this. But blame them.
All right, thank
So,
you. Oh, sorry, Alexander, go ahead and then share.
well, it was I was addressed, so I should probably say something. Yeah, so I mean, if it was kind of an argument made by Nietzsche in some sense that both the Jews and the Christians are responsible for all this egalitarianism going around Western civilization, right? And in some sense, you have to say that the Christian concern for the underdog, which is not, Judaism's not immune from that also. God saved slaves in Egypt. He's not on the side of the Pharaoh. He's on the side of the slave caste, right? Most peoples in history imagine themselves as children of gods and so forth. But the Christian concern for the victim, the underdog, the socially marginalized, the oppressed, has done all kinds of wonderful reformist things, including Christian culture was the one that abolished slavery, right, effectively. To give you one example, you won't find that in other civilizations. But it can also be retooled by ideologies when it lacks the Augustinian realism of balancing this concern for the poor, the weak, the marginal, with the fact that all human beings are fallen and sinners, and we have to make peace with the fact that man is not perfectible and history is not perfectible, and we need social institutions to keep order in an imperfect world with imperfect people. So that's what I would say is the conservative use of how conservatism can draw, in some sense, on Christianity.
Thank you, Shale.
Oh, just briefly to reformulate some of the points and then get reactions to this. So what Stephen said about dualism, I think that's very important. Okay, so Marxism didn't just have self-worship of the revolutionary elite, that was God on earth, but it also had made capitalism and other previous civilizations into a form of absolute evil by comparison. So what happened when the God died, the good God died, is that they kept the devil, right? The devil, they still worship the devil. That is the absolute belief that the status quo and tradition is evil, and they refuse to relinquish that belief as an empirical proposition. That is a religious belief. So the way to attack them is to demand that they not maintain a religious allegiance like that, is to demand that they discuss it empirically, the relative value of different aspects of tradition as compared to what they recommend.
Okay, Alexander or Stephen, do you want to respond quickly? And then we have one more question.
Oh, I think that's right. It's a hard argument to make, given the fact that they're protected by ideology, which resists argumentation. It's passion on their side. And you got to have some way of sapping the passion.
Yep. I mean, I just to say, I totally agree with Shale about this idea of the Marxist hatred for all that came before is what's taken up in the sort of neo-progressivism, with basically class struggle being replaced by identity politics in some way, and judging all of one's own past from the vantage point of this idealized future.
Okay, great. And then we have one last question from Ed, and we do have some conversation in the chat as well.
Yeah, thank you to both of you who spoke. It was very, very interesting, and I appreciate these are two aspects of the phenomenon, but both of you were emphasizing the positive. In Stephen's case, it was the people who wanted to achieve something for themselves by opposing the current order, reforming it. And in Alexander's case, it was a kind of millennialism that becomes imminent, and so we have to hate what goes before. And my question is whether that's really going to account for the depth of the hatred, the oikophobic depth that we're experiencing, and the sense of guilt and responsibility and all of these other phenomena that seem to be so much a part of this. I don't want to undermine what you said, but in addition to that, there's just seems to be so much more to it that the people who are the real oikophobes really feel their privilege has made them guilty of exploitation. I wonder if either of you care to comment on that.
Well, there are various degrees of neuroticism, I suppose, among oikophobes and how much guilt they feel. A hatred is is part of the standard kit of human emotions. And it's a very important, I'm not justifying hatred, but it's a very important adaptive emotion because it gives you the ability to take risks and be bold and be aggressive and report danger and all that kind of stuff. So when people hate, they're often empowered by that hate. Now, they can be hateful and guilty at the same time, or a mixed bag of things. But hatred is not, in the larger sense, larger kind of human adaptive terms, is not a defect. It can often be a powerful asset. Should be thought about in those terms.
I would just also say I would not underestimate the level of hatred of past revolutionary and we could say secular millenarian and actual millenarian ideologies. If you think about the tens of millions of people killed by Marxists, and which included mass destruction, the looting of Confucius's tomb during the Cultural Revolution and the burning of churches, murder of priests, and all these sorts of things. There seemed to be an awful lot of hatred there. And, I think that a very Manichaean view of history as a struggle between good and evil, and your enemy is malevolent, not just flawed or erroneous, can lead to, and we need to be on the side of the virtuous, can lead to real hatred, and history has shown real atrocities.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I want to give a large round of applause and gratitude for Stephen Balch and Alexander Rosenthal-Pubul. And thank you, Gabriel Dancing, for being our host. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. We do have a YouTube channel, so most of our recorded speeches are there. and we look forward to having you next time.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Sophia. And let me just conclude by saying that I was very happy to see the controversy that this topic has aroused, not just in our private group, but now in the larger group. And we have several more sessions on this topic planned. So please stay tuned, and we hope to see you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.